All right, folks, Ziegler here with you, along with Randolph the Wonder Kitty, who is on the wife's side of the bed. And if she were here, she'd kill me. Don't tell. Okay, so I'm going to do this real quickly. I think for sure I can get it 25 minutes, maximum 30. A look at Eastern Europe after World War II. By this time in class, we've already looked at certainly the immediate Cold War period and that division between East and West. What do you call that imaginary line that goes between East and West Germany and Czechoslovakia and all this? That is the Iron Curtain, term of Winston Churchill. Well, we're going to look at the next 20 or so years afterwards in this so-called Eastern Bloc. If you have a look at the map, you see the Soviet Union here with all of its satellite states. Think about this. What does a satellite do? It orbits around something. An Earth's communication satellite orbits around the Earth. Suggests that the Soviet Union is the center, and all of these countries of Eastern Europe, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, etc., all revolve around the Soviet Union. The one interesting one is Yugoslavia. We'll get to that later. Very interesting. You are seeing, by the way, remember that in Eastern Germany, you see that little kind of gray color that you see in the middle of Eastern Germany? That is the city of Berlin. And you'll recall that the western half of that city is a part of West Germany, and the eastern half is East Germany. What you're looking at right now is a photograph that includes both East and West Berlin. Stop the video for a second. Is this building in East Berlin or West Berlin? And these people, which one are they in? See if you got the answer right. This woman is leaping from an apartment building in East Berlin to relative in her mind freedom in West Berlin. And these people underneath with a net are going to catch her. People from East Berlin, East Germany, were not allowed to go from east to west. And hence, this apartment building, which was still right on that border, people would get to the building and leap over into the west. So, pretty dramatic photograph there. So, what we called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, or Soviet Union, or we could even just say Russian, as we often do, because the dominant part of it was Russia. Strictly speaking, all of these other people were republics that were a part of the Soviet Union, equal partners. All the stands you see down to the south, and Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Ukraine, kind of in the news these days, and Belarus and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc. These were all equal partners in this great Soviet system. Needless to say, it was the Russians who dominated. And most of these other states, it turns out, did not really want to be a part of the Soviet Union, at least in varying different areas. But we find this out when the Soviet Union breaks apart. In the Soviet Union itself, we've talked a little about this already, but the police state, the military state continues afterwards. After the war, massive purges. Recall that Stalin did those before World War II. Well, after World War II, anybody in this new society that could not be counted upon. Now, one would assume that prisoners of war coming back, having given up years of their life for Russia, would be treated as heroes. Well, in many cases, they weren't because they'd been around foreigners picking up foreign ideas and, well, couldn't be trusted any longer. Many of them are sent off to these awful prison camps like you're seeing in Siberia in the photograph. Others were executed, starved, or basically marginalized within society. Same thing with people from these new ethnic groups, like, well, you are an equal Soviet student, citizen, yet, you know what? You're actually Kazakhstani or you're Uzbeki. You are Muslim, and we are not Muslims. You are suspect in some way. And Jewish populations within Russia, who had always been badly treated within Russia, they get a lot of the same after the war. And a dissident, somebody who dissents, somebody who disagrees, you are a writer who questions the Soviet system. You are an artist that doesn't produce approved of art. Also, you were very often marginalized, attacked, imprisoned, etc. We looked at this earlier, socialist realism. This is what art is for. The one purpose, you can see more detail here in the quote on the right, but the purpose of art is not self-expression or getting to the inner truths of life or telling us what you think or feel. No, the purpose of all art, including writing and of course sculpture and painting and poetry, you name it, is to strengthen the revolution. So good, useful art, Stalin standing bravely in the middle of all the strong soldiers, Stalin in the beautiful Russian countryside with beautiful children presenting with flowers. The one on the bottom left is pretty hard to buy into, but this is Lenin seated in the middle. And what is Lenin doing? And I'm sure this never happened in real life. Lenin was calmly explaining to the Russian peasants the truth and the beauty of communism. And you'll notice they're listening. Well, that's art. Art is there to strengthen the socialist system, the communist system. Absolutely. Stalin finally dies in 1953. Heart attack, I believe. Maybe it was a stroke. I don't recall exactly. But, he was in his early 70s by then. It's very hard to determine how many deaths an individual leader was responsible for. Even with Hitler, can you say that every person who died during World War II in Europe, because Hitler began this, Hitler gets, it's tricky with this. You could even say, for example, in Poland, well, all Poles that were killed, but what about the Russian invasion? What about the non-aggression pact that allowed World War II and that invasion to happen? So it's tough to come up with this. I think it's difficult, from what I have read, to put the numbers for premature deaths caused under Stalinist probably in that 20 million, 15 million, some say higher, 25, 30 million. Stalin was a sociopath. I don't think there's any other way to put this. He was a vicious, suspicious, pretty insane guy for whom human life didn't mean a whole lot. If you're talking about the largest body counts of the 20th century, I mean, it's certainly Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong of China in some order. And again, it'd be very hard to come up with these. But Stalin is dead. And the question is, who now takes over the Soviet Union? US system, it's easy, right? Joe Biden were to die, Kamala Harris, the vice president, would be inaugurated the next day. In the Soviet system, government is run by the leadership of the Communist Party. And always, when there is a sudden change in leadership, generally somebody dies, there is competition for that position. You might remember that Lenin died in 1924. Well, Stalin did not formally and officially take power until 1926. And kind of the same thing happens here. Stalin dies in 1953, and there's a behind the scenes power struggle. It is eventually won by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev, yes, devout communist, KGB, you name it. He's absolutely with this. But what's interesting about Khrushchev is when he formally takes power in 1956, one of his first acts is to call together a Communist Party, a Politburo, it's called, but it's the Communist Party Organizing Committee. And he says, we need to be honest about history. For so long we lived under Stalin. Stalin was not a hero. Stalin was a monster. I am all for communism. I am absolutely a believer in Lenin, but we need to reject what Stalin did to our people. His own words, we denounce the crimes of the Stalin era, described his intolerance, his brutality, his abuse of power. And this, of course, is shocking to people that Stalin, who for 27 years you didn't even think anything bad about him or you were at risk. Khrushchev says it's a new day. And this does lead to a slightly more open Soviet Union. I don't want to overstate this. You were not free under Khrushchev to stand up and denounce communism. You would find yourself in a prison camp, to be sure. But there is some economic opening, some decisions not made by the government, and as long as you were accepting communism as a positive good, you could at least express, under some circumstances, mild or measured criticisms of the Soviet government. The economy, you know what? It seems to work pretty well. Remember, centralizing, in theory, all decisions in a communist economy are made by the government and they plan and they allocate, and there is no private enterprise. And that's still the system under Khrushchev, but less so. That private decisions are left a little bit more to individuals, to some small businesses, to some regional parts. It wasn't quite as controlled from Moscow. And the idea was that this might make it more efficient and allow for a better economy. And by 1960, the Soviet Union's economy is probably the second largest in the world. Now, on one hand, there are a lot of Russians. There are 200 million people. The Soviet Union, it's like close to 300 million. So it would be a large economy. And certainly, standard of living in Japan, Western Germany, the United States, much higher per person, no question about that. But nonetheless, thinking of how absolutely destroyed the Soviet Union was after World War II, 20, 25 million dead, tens of millions more wounded and otherwise damaged, and all the damage to the factories and the farmland, it is pretty remarkable that the Soviet Union numbers were showing that their economy had grown so much. Now, you'll notice I say that the figures were suspect. Remember, the official numbers would say our economy grew by 8% last year. And there was economic growth during the Khrushchev years. But remember that there is no free press. There is no people that can say, wait a minute, let's take a look at those numbers. Is this actually accurate? Certainly, some of the numbers that the Soviet Union were releasing about their remarkable levels of economic growth and the great standard of living, well, they were made up. They were made up to a degree. So weren't really quite as good as the Soviets presented. And you'll notice you see Khrushchev here. He's speaking at the United Nations over on the top right. At one point, he grabbed his shoe off his foot, pounded it on the lectern, and said to the West, "Communism will bury the West." Now, he did not actually mean that as a "we have nuclear weapons and we will destroy you." What he meant was, and seem to believe this, that the communist system in the long run would be better, more effective, and capitalism would just destroy itself. So the way of the future is our way, and we will bury capitalism. I'm not going to worry about the kitchen debate. If you're curious about it, ask a question. It's kind of funny more than anything else. So Khrushchev, again, coming into power at a different time. Look, by the time we get to 1949 with NATO and the Berlin crisis, that Iron Curtain in Europe was pretty firm. There was really no sense of what if the Soviet Union invades France. It just wasn't going to happen. There was no sense that the United States would invade Eastern Germany and try to pull it back. This was not going to happen. So, recognizing that the United States and Soviet Union had largely resolved Europe, at least for the time being, Khrushchev openly says, I am calling for peaceful coexistence with the West. We have different systems, we have different beliefs. As much as possible, let's get along with each other. It's not going to do anybody any good to be building up weapons system, threatening each other with war, or God help us, going to war with nuclear weapons. Can we find ways to agree to disagree? I guess that's the way to put it. And that sounds nice. And certainly it wasn't quite as adversarial as under Stalin. That said, though, there are multiple incidents that suggest the United States and Soviet Union are far from being friends. There's the U-2 incident in 1960. Well, the Soviets say, and we just shot down an American spy plane flying over the Soviet Union. And the Americans say, yeah, see, this is nonsense. This did not happen. You're making it up. It's propaganda. At which point the Soviets say, oh, really? Because the plane we shot down, the pilot survived. Here he is. And they brought him onto television, which, first of all, showed the United States had been spying and lying. And what else rhymes with that? Frying, dying? Now we'll just stick with that. They had been spying and lying. and were called out publicly, and that created some further tension. The Berlin Wall had mentioned so many East Germans were moving from East Germany to West, the Soviet Union simply put up a literal 85-mile wall to separate East and West. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't have time to go into this here. This might be a great question for somebody because it's pretty chilling. We came pretty close, we think, to an actual nuclear war. So the United States and Soviet Union are not buddies for all the talk of peaceful coexistence. By the way, the fact that Khrushchev finally had to back down in Cuba led to Communist Party leaders in the Soviet Union losing faith in him. He was pulled out of power in 1964. A man named Leonid Brezhnev took off. Brezhnev, by the way, the best thing he is known for today is the biggest eyebrows you've ever seen. Look for a picture of Leonid Brezhnev. He had eyebrows the size of my head. I don't know how else to put it. One little thing that happened, or it's worth mentioning, is Sputnik. This was a satellite. It was a little mechanical thing, not big, size of a soccer ball, tiny, and it didn't have space lasers or explosives. It was just a chunk of metal, but the Soviets figured out the technology to have it circle the Earth within the Earth's office, and this absolutely freaked out the United States because it wasn't just this chunk of metal called Sputnik. I don't know what Sputnik means, but it's definitely a Russian term. It's not just that Sputnik existed and the Russians got into space. What more could the Russians do? Next time, could it be a nuclear weapons delivery system? This leads to a sense in the United States that we need to develop our technology and outpace the Soviet Union. Then we talk about these so-called satellite states. Remember, these are figurative. That other thing, that was a literal satellite, Sputnik. These are metaphorical satellites. This is East Germany and Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, you know the list of countries that were independent countries, but let's face it, they revolved around the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union made the big decisions about them. You'll notice you see all the countries in blue, those are NATO countries. Switzerland and Austria remained neutral, as did Sweden. Yugoslavia, we'll get to this in a moment, also remains neutral, although communist. What you've suddenly got in Europe, though, is including the USSR and Poland and all the others, you're talking about maybe 100 million's a little high, but we're talking about, 80, 90 million Europeans who are living under communism in Europe. Add to that China and 3 to 400 million as of 1949. And then by the 60s and 70s, we have Vietnam, we have Cambodia, we have North Korea, we have Cuba. Clearly, the Western fear of the domino system, that little by little one country turns communist, it'll spread. Well, to some degree, that seems to be happening. What does the Soviet Union do in all of these countries? Again, officially, these were free, independent countries that chose communism. That was not the reality. First of all, they collectivized the agriculture that was in these areas. Stalin had these plans, massive collectivization and modernization of agriculture, build up a food surplus, send the food and the people into the cities. The people in the cities develop more heavy industries, steel, modernize, etc. One thing, though, that is clear about this, although in some cases it may have benefited these Eastern European countries, a lot of the wealth, the proceeds, the production went directly into Russia. These were all one-party states. I don't mean just the Saturday only. I mean the Communist Party was the political party in all of these states. Did they have elections? They did. In Czechoslovakia, you could vote for the member of the Communist Party, or you could vote for the member of the Communist Party. And those were the free elections. They did not exist. Now, again, the communists would say, well, look, in Western Europe and the United States, multi-millionaires and billionaires buy their candidates, spend all the money on media, and they just end up electing a bunch of rich people who don't represent the common person. So there's some logic to that, but nonetheless, there are not democratic elections within Eastern European states. Going to look at 4 examples of where Eastern Europeans stood up. Dissent means disagreement. First would be in Yugoslavia. Now, remember that initially there used to be a Serbia on the map, and you remember Bosnia was an area controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was kind of the flashpoint for World War. And then after World War One, all of this area was formed as the Southern Slavic people. Yugoslavia means Southern Slavs. And that included the dominant Serbians and the Croats and the Slovenes and the Bosnians and all kinds of different folks. It was very, very diverse. Also included both Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, and a large Muslim population. And you can see that there might be some reasons for disagreements. Croats and Serbs, they're not the same people, and they have a history with each other. The leader of this Yugoslavia for about close to 40 years, I think 35 years, Josip Broz Tito, Tito. You see him on the right. And he was not cuddly. He was not a warm, big hug. He ruled with an iron fist. Certainly, you would call him a dictator to his credit, and a lot of Yugoslavians today, I've talked to people in the former Yugoslavia, in many cases say, yes, there were some restrictions on freedom, but he held the country together. And one of the things that we see after Yugoslavia abandoned communism in the 1980s, 1990s, civil war broke out massively because it turns out the Serbs, the Croats, the Bosnians, the Christians, the Catholics, the Muslims, they didn't all get along with each other. If that happened under Tito's time period, you start seeing Serbs attacking Croats, I'll tell you, he'd come into the military and put a stop to it and create unity. So, again, changes and revolutions don't always lead to something better. Here's what makes Yugoslavia different. Tito is a communist, without question, a little bit less ideological, but he's a communist. But he distrusts Stalin and the Soviet Union. And in 1948, he announces Yugoslavia is a communist state. Got it. But we are not aligned with the Soviet Union. We will have a non aligned foreign policy. We will work with the capitalist countries, with the communist countries, and particularly these new developing nations in the so-called third world. So that is a difference. Turns out the United States, even though he was a communist, was a lot more comfortable with Joseph Tito than the Soviet Union was, which is kind of interesting. There was a rebellion in East Germany in 1953. Understand that line between East and West Germany, that is artificial. This is the German people. It didn't make sense to many Germans. And you see actually millions of Germans who, while they could, got out of East Germany into Western Germany, either in Berlin or in other ways. Well, there was a rebellion. The government of East Germany in 1953 said, look, we're loyal communists, but we are not going to follow the Soviet system, and the Soviet Union puts the rebellion down in a hurry. In 1961, because so many East Berliners, here you see an East German soldier leaping over the barbed wire into West Berlin. You see him responding with that. The Soviet Union decides, well, the East German government, but the Soviet Union is the one that makes the decision. The Soviet Union says, okay, fine, we're going to build a wall through Berlin, 86 miles long. Great. And it's set up so that people can't go from east to west. Very similar, of course, what Israel's built in Palestine, that separating people with a physical wall. There are people in the United States that are talking about doing the same thing with the United States and Mexico. My mind usually ends up leading to some pretty bad things, but that's me. And there is the East Berlin. I actually went through East Berlin when the wall was there in 1985. This is before cell phones. I had a little baby camera with me. I was either out of film or I lost the film, so I have no pictures of it, but did go through the checkpoint there into East Germany, which was a very different place than what I was seeing in West Germany, in West Berlin at the time. This is just one of those amusing moments. President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, president when the Berlin Wall was set up, and speaking before people, he wanted to make it clear the United States stands with the freedom loving people of East Berlin. And he said, I say to the world, Ich bin ein Berliner. Now, those of you who speak some German in this class might say, you don't say, Ich bin ein Amerikaner. Ich bin ein Deutscher. You don't say that. You would just say, Ich bin Deutscher. Ich bin Amerikaner. The way of saying I am a Berliner, I am a person from Berlin in my heart, is Ich bin Berliner. Ich bin ein Berliner is stating that you are a type of German pastry, a donut, if you were, filled with jelly or cream or something like that. Technically speaking, John Kennedy said that he is a jelly donut or something along those lines, but just an amusing little moment in history. Two other rebellions to look at. One is in Hungary in 1956. Now, wait, 1956, isn't that the year that Khrushchev took over? Yes. Didn't Khrushchev say that Stalin had been wrong and a monster? Yes. And you know what? Countries in Eastern Europe said, well, if the way we've been doing things are bad, does that mean we can make some changes? And, in Poland, they start making some changes to their economy and changes to government. And they're kind of wondering, how's the Soviet Union going to respond? And Khrushchev lets it happen. And a couple other Eastern states initiate small reforms. It's a little bit like you come in 10 minutes after curfew, mom doesn't say anything, the next time it's a half an hour. Can I get away with an hour? You're seeing how far you can push the limits. Well, Hungarians under Imre Nagy, Nagy, it's pronounced Nagy in Hungarian, says, look, we are loyal communists, absolutely, but we're going to do it in a different way. We are going to decentralize the economy, more free enterprise. We are going to start electing our parliament, and we are going to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. Remember, that was the Soviet Union's equivalent of NATO. That was too much for the Soviet Union. You can make some little changes, but to say you are no longer a part of our alliance, the Soviet Union comes in and crushes the rebellion. Thought the body count was 25,000 people killed. Prime Minister Nagy is executed. Later executions. Anybody pretending for a moment that the Soviet Union doesn't dominate Eastern Europe, it was clear. Up until this point, the Soviets liked to claim, oh, no, the Hungarians want to follow our system. No, it was imposed, absolutely. And now the world had evidence. 12 years later, Czechs try the same thing. This is a time of worldwide revolution. Paris is shut down during some protests in 1968. The streets are flooded with protests in the United States, and the Czech people pick up on this, tired of the Soviet system. The Prime Minister, Alexander Dubček, says, we're going to create a communism with a human face. We believe in the general ideas of communism, but we're going to abandon the Soviet Union. And just like in Hungary 12 years earlier, the Soviet Union sends in its military, puts an end to it. Dubček is arrested, imprisoned for many years, etc. By the way, if you were to take the number 68 and flip it over 180 degrees, what would it say? It would say 89. Interesting. When Czechoslovakia and the rest of Eastern Europe abandons communism and breaks away from the Soviet Union, that's in 1989. And Czechs were fond of saying 89 is 68, failed revolution, upside down. All right, far as we have to go on this, got this in at 28 minutes, not so bad. So make sure you've taken good notes on this, couple of good questions for the class, things you'd like to know more about, things you didn't quite understand, and on we go. Randolph, say goodbye, Randolph. You saying goodbye? Well, he's asleep, but there we go. Bye.